my name's Bimundalak. I want to talk about praxis. You've probably heard the word, but I think defining it could be helpful. We spend a lot of time online having the discourse about different aspects of theory and debunking right-wingers, and that's great. That's useful. But how do you take all that information and move it to the real world? How do we go from talking about anarchism and communism to living in a stateless, classless society? Theory and praxis are sometimes juxtaposed against each other, but really they must coexist. Praxis without theory is a rudderless ship that is doomed to crash against the rocks, but theory without praxis is the blueprint for a ship that will never sail. Praxis is of urgent importance. A revolution isn't just some romantic idea in the far-flung future. It's not an opportunity to do violence against people you just dislike. It's not an inevitable messiah that we can just wait for. A revolution is a real, substantial change. It's personal, interpersonal, systemic, and global. For the people whose homes are being lost to the rising ocean, for people whose families are broken by incarceration and state violence, for people who are too disabled to perform wage labor, for women and LGBT people whose reproductive rights are being stripped from them, revolution is life and death. Our timeline is short because of climate change. If we're going to make revolution happen, really make it happen, then we have to act. We have to let our theory drive us to praxis and act in accordance with our principles. The way I personally conceive of praxis is in 3 categories: constructive, defensive or deconstructive, and insurrectionary. Constructive praxis would be things like unionizing, community organizing, mutual aid, and building dual power structures. It strives to meet the needs of communities and build solidarity. Defensive or deconstructive praxis can be either reactive or proactive. It seeks to mitigate harm from the state, capital, and reactionary elements either by reacting in the moment or deconstructing harmful institutions. It might be in violation of the law, but not necessarily. It includes things like squatting, protests, strikes, ICE Watch, and anti-fascist actions. It breaks down current institutions via popular power and collective organizing, and provides community self-defense against violence from the state and from capital and from reactionaries like fascists. Insurrectionary praxis is praxis that's usually illegal, but specifically advances other praxis that has come up against a wall of suppression from the state, capital, or fascists. It's necessary to keep communication about this kind of praxis secure and only among people that you trust. These are loose categories that I've just sort of made up. I didn't read this somewhere, this is just how I personally think of praxis, and it helps me make goals and decisions. Some actions could fall into more than one category, and you can't do one category of praxis without the others. Constructive praxis without deconstructive praxis will be interrupted by legal barriers and state suppression. Deconstructive praxis without constructive praxis will leave people's needs unmet and alienate the larger community. Insurrectionary praxis on its own will get you arrested or even killed and may put innocent people in danger. However, without people willing to take risks and bold action together, a revolution will be stalled at insufficient incremental reforms, or be recuperated or suppressed, or fail altogether. Praxis of all kinds should be, as much as possible, intentional, well-planned, well-communicated, and integrated into a larger revolutionary framework. Praxis that is done collectively will always be more effective than praxis done as an individual, but there are things individuals can do on their own while they build solidarity and build a network. There's another way to divide up praxis that I feel is compatible with my categories. There's a fun anarchist board game called Block by Block that's basically a tutorial for how to riot. In it, the players are divided into labor, territorial, student, and prison groups. These 4 sectors are also a useful way to think about organizing. The 4 sectors have different interests, but are inherently related in their struggles. Students are being educated so they can enter the labor sector. The prison sector is used as a threat of violence to coerce the labor sector into working, either by threat of failure in the job market or by actual forced unpaid labor. The territorial sector provides reproductive labor for the other sectors and includes housing and child raising. Building praxis in a way that is aware of these sectors and strives to be multi-sectorial can help it be purpose-driven and successful. For my categories, let's first talk about constructive praxis. I really believe this is where the heart of revolution is. I first thought about it this way when I was watching the Libertarian Socialist Rants video, and he described prefiguration as building the new society in the shell of the old. Human beings in our communities have basic needs: food, water, and shelter first and foremost. We're still going to need those things if the state and capital both disappear tomorrow, so finding ways to secure those things is the first step to ensuring the success of a revolution. An individualist way to look at this would be doomsday prepping. People spend hundreds and thousands of dollars stockpiling the goods that they'll need for themselves and their families when, quote, shit hits the fan. Unfortunately, but unsurprisingly, many people in this hobby are right-wing, and they also stockpile guns and weapons with the express purpose of fighting off anybody who might try to take their hoarded resources. Many of these hoards are also manufactured goods like canned or dried food, paper goods, and other things that are hard to replicate by hand. Indulge me for a moment though, if you will. We didn't evolve with claws and fur. We didn't evolve with gnashing teeth. Our babies don't walk for over a year after they're born. We're not like different species of animals, like predators and prey. We evolved with nimble, articulate hands and big, sociable brains. It's clear to me, in my admittedly subjective opinion, that we're geared especially for two things: using tools and cooperating with each other. I personally don't think that we would have survived as a species for so long if we hadn't formed families and communities and cities. The phenomenon of single-generation families living in separated homes is really relatively new, and it very conveniently plays into the alienation of capitalism and the individualism of liberalism. It makes communities harder to build and solidarity harder to form and collective action harder to take. When we consider communal living, it's easy to picture the stereotypes of dirty hippies in a crowded, unpleasant living spaces and painstaking work, but I think it's intentional that we're made to think of it that way. To transition out of capitalism, we're going to have to change a lot about the way that we live. We can start adopting more cooperative ways of living to meet our needs today to make that change easier. If the individualist answer to constructive praxis is doomsday prepping, I think the collectivist answer is permaculture and intentional cooperation over competition. Things like housing cooperatives, community gardens, food forests, and municipal acquisition of private water, power, and internet companies are a great way to start. Communes and unions are a staple of most anarchist and communist ideas of a post-revolutionary world. We can start building those now as structures that will carry us through a revolution and help keep people alive and fed and housed. Unions especially have a constructive function and a defensive function. As much as they help workers demand their rights from their capitalist employers, they can also form the radical structures that the new society could be built on. I'll include a really fantastic article in the description about the revolutionary potential of unions. Both tenants' unions and labor unions can help form the collective, consensus-based administrative structure that communes and federations would use during and after the revolution. If you'd like tips on how to unionize your workplace, the Chapo Trap House episode about Anchor Steam Brewery is a good blueprint, and the IWW is pretty much always happy to take questions and give advice. There are also other models, like popular assemblies and workers' councils, which might be better suited to some areas than others. Constructive praxis doesn't have to be that ambitious, though. Doing something is always better than doing nothing. It can be as simple as meeting an unmet need in your community with people you trust. One of my patrons in LA, Red Andre, was recently struck by the severity of the typhus epidemic in the LA homeless community, so he started a fundraiser to buy wet wipes for homeless people to keep them from getting infected. I'll link his fundraiser in the description if you'd like to help him out. Here in Little Rock, some people in the local DIY punk scene saw the severity of the opioid epidemic and started the Central Arkansas Harm Reduction Project. They distribute free naloxone, fentanyl test strips, clean needles, condoms, and other things that help keep people safe. A good example from history is the Black Panthers Free Breakfast program for children, in which they fed children in poor Black communities. It's about being involved in your community and keeping your eyes open for opportunities to help others while being guided by revolutionary principles. Constructive praxis will always be more effective when done collectively and as part of a larger revolutionary blueprint. What good is it to be constructive if you don't know what it is you're constructing? This could easily fall into a pattern of liberalism, of campaigning to elect capitalists who will put us in the same wars as other capitalists because they're better at beautifying the inherent violence of state and capital. The reason I've called this category constructive is that the idea is to build something that can't be recuperated by capital or controlled and revoked by the state. Hierarchical society has a top-down power structure, and the idea is to build enough collective power from the bottom up to reverse the flow of power and provide the parallel functions to meet people's needs. The idea is to become ungovernable. That's why, as an anarchist, I think it's important to keep organizing decentralized in leadership and horizontal in execution. Organizing with a rigid hierarchical structure means that there is someone at the top who can be taken out and then the whole thing is derailed. Black Rose Rosa Negra Anarchist Federation is an anarchist organization that's focused entirely on constructive anarchist praxis. In fact, by the time this video comes out, we should almost have established a new Little Rock local of Black Rose. I'll be joining officially as soon as possible. Their blog has a lot of great interviews and analyses of prefigurative praxis in places around the world. Constructive praxis is also usually above board and quote-unquote respectable, which is another reason it runs the risk of becoming liberal if it's not done in a principled, radical way. It's the category that's the least likely to be met with state suppression, at least up to a certain point. Unfortunately, the right wing understands this too. While right-wing violence echoes the violence of the state and capital, it's also subject to state suppression and liberal pearl clutching if it goes too extreme. I've seen an outright fascist tradcath third positionist group engage in charity work and community building to create a veneer of respectability and clout for their less savory organizing. That's also a classic KKK tactic, hosting events and doing charity work for the white people they want in their ethno-state as a way to garner goodwill in the communities. In a way, this is propaganda of the deed. Usually that has another connotation, which we'll discuss later, don't worry. But unless the left engages with people's struggles on their level in a way that meets their needs, we will fail to build revolutionary popular power. Any more drastic revolutionary action will be unpopular and will leave people in jeopardy of starvation, homelessness, etc. You can punch as many Nazis as you want, but if you're not advancing people's struggles in other ways, that's pretty meaningless and performative. Gaining popular support is a key aspect of constructive praxis. While we can meet people where they're at by meeting their material needs, we can also bring them to the left by showing them what's possible in a revolution. The distribution of propaganda is hugely helpful in this. Boiling down key points of dense theory into accessible images, words, and aesthetics allows people a gateway into class consciousness. YouTubers like Wobbly Street and Flea Market Socialist have a lot of creative methods for spreading agitprop or agitation propaganda to people who otherwise might not have access to it. Anarchism especially has a long history of wheat pasting, flyering, and stickering public areas with agitprop to spur people's curiosity. Video games, like A Bewitching Revolution, and even videos on BreadTube or LeftTube are great tools to complement conversations that you have in your life with friends and family members and coworkers about revolutionary ideas. And we need to be having these conversations, especially with people who aren't already on the left. One of my favorite hobbies is bread pilling my Uber drivers or people who are waiting with me at the bus stop. I let the other person guide the conversation and find opportunities to carefully nudge them leftwards. I once had an Uber driver who was complaining about the homeless population in downtown Little Rock, so I said, "Right, it's ridiculous that we have all these abandoned buildings and people still have to sleep on the street." Another good approach to that one is, yeah, all these trendy businesses moved in and the rents got too high. I wonder how many people just couldn't afford their homes anymore. I'm not telling the person they're wrong, I'm giving them a yes and. I'm validating a feeling they have, like the homeless population being too large, and giving them an explanation rooted in class consciousness like gentrification or the injustice of private property. I never push people, and I'm constantly gauging their reaction to see how far I should go. It's similar to the way fascists talk about hiding their power level, except that my intention is to build solidarity with this person and ignite a revolutionary spark in them based on empathy for their fellow humans and rejection of their own oppression. At times, I've backed off completely without trying because I felt that the person would react poorly, and at other times I've openly said, "I'm a communist," and given them a card with my contact information on it. I haven't heard back from anyone about it yet, but I figure it can't hurt, and maybe they'll get curious enough to look things up in their own time. And that's just on an individual level. On an organizational level, there's the concept of social work and social insertion. I'll include a short article about it, but the very basic idea is to form a group of radical activists that can join local social movements and organizations, generate and participate in revolutionary action within those groups, and push discourse into a revolutionary direction. It's not about gaining control, it's about shifting action and conversation to the left. It's really fascinating. When constructive praxis starts to meet people's needs in any substantial way, it threatens the legitimacy of the state and capital. There tends to be backlash. Organizations like Food Not Bombs get shut down by police. Co-ops face red tape and zoning issues from cities until they collapse in a war of financial attrition. Here, constructive praxis can start to bleed into what I'm going to call defensive or deconstructive praxis. When I say defensive, you might want to ask what I'm defending or who I'm defending against. In the context of a focused plan of revolutionary praxis, it's about defending constructive efforts from suppression. In a wider context, it's about defending the working class from the state and capital. It can be about defending marginalized people from fascistic or reactionary elements. In an even broader context, it's about proactively dismantling the inherently violent and oppressive institutions of the state, capital, and cultural hegemony. When constructive praxis, especially prefigurative praxis, starts to threaten and undermine the structures of state and capital, it will be subject to suppression. J. Edgar Hoover famously said that, of all the radical black groups, the Black Panthers were the greatest threat to the internal security of the country because of their free breakfast program. The FBI's attempts to destroy the program included sending forged letters to stores to discourage them from donating food, spreading rumors that the food was poison, and even raiding the sites while children ate. All for feeding kids. It's necessary to counter the forces that would suppress revolutionary activity, but for a lot of marginalized people, continuing to exist and to thrive and have kids and love each other is revolutionary activity. Their oppression, and all the oppression of the working class, is suppression of revolutionary activity. Therefore, the best defensive praxis is praxis that deconstructs the antagonistic forces of the state, capital, and social hegemony like patriarchy and white supremacy. I'm dividing this category, therefore, into defensive praxis versus deconstructive praxis, with deconstruction being a radical form of defense. Defensive measures can be done inside the system, either by changing existing laws or by making new policy. This is usually where liberal political action stops. They have faith in the system and have no interest in working outside of it. But defensive praxis has no end. It's reactive. It's like a never-ending whack-a-mole. It only exists in response to antagonism and has no answer for moving beyond antagonism. While this defensive praxis is insufficient in itself, it's still key for allowing people to organize more effectively for radical praxis. This is where I see the utility of electoral politics, even though I'm a leftist. Incremental reforms and liberal politicians aren't answers on their own, but the organizing surrounding elections can be repurposed for more radical organizing after elections, and incremental reforms give people breathing room for more radical action. Someone who makes a living wage will be less likely to lose their housing if they get arrested at a protest. Someone with cancer won't have to work 60+ hours a week to pay for their medication if they have universal health care, and that free time and those resources can be put into radical organizing and building dual power structures. The reforms themselves won't take us to the goal of a classless, stateless, moneyless society, but they can enable the actions that will if we organize in principled ways and educate ourselves and our comrades about revolutionary theory and history. One definition of the state that I personally prefer is the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. The obvious example here is the police. I scarcely find a leftist that doesn't agree with the age-old, all cops are bastards, but defense from police is a key part of any praxis that intends to be inclusive of marginalized and over-policed communities. Police are the domestic arm of state violence, so I'm going to use them primarily to talk about defensive praxis. Portland Assembly has a great guide to how to build an anti-racist neighborhood action committee. This is a form of community action that includes surveillance and tracking of police activity, systems for warning communities about potential violence, and occasionally countering police activity in person. Similar systems are also set up to watch for ICE activity. On an individual or small-scale basis, filming or even live streaming all your interactions with the police can be life-saving. Aside from just having potential evidence of a police misconduct or discrimination, surveillance has a dampening effect on bad behavior. If an officer knows they're being filmed, it can save lives. There was a case recently in West Helena, Arkansas, where a black man was pulled over by a white police officer at a gas station. The driver started live streaming to Facebook immediately. The cop had his gun drawn and was pointing it at the driver. The cop ordered him to exit the car, but the driver didn't want to put his hands out of view to put the car in park. The cop, with no prompting, shouted, "Gun!" and then looked into the camera, realizing he was being filmed. I firmly believe that man would be dead if he hadn't been filming. He was able to open the car door and he was promptly slammed to the ground by the cop. This is where people who are white like myself have an extra advantage. Not only are things like that less likely to happen to us, but our presence and our surveillance of police can have an even stronger dampening effect on their violence. If you're white, consider it your duty to record the police. Don't get in their way, don't be aggressive, and don't put someone else's life in further danger, but make your presence known and make it known that you're recording their activity. One of the most important parts of police-related defensive praxis is very simple. Stop calling the cops. Especially for things like noise complaints or other frivolous matters that could be solved with simply talking to your neighbors and building stronger relationships in your community. When you introduce police into a situation, you introduce the legitimacy of state violence, no matter what the situation is. If you call the police on a person of color, you're saying, to some degree, that death would be an acceptable punishment for whatever transgression you think has happened. You need to consider that every time you call the police. Is this worth escalating the violence involved? It's important to look at what happens to people after they end up on the wrong side of the police, too. Innocent people are jailed every day or jailed for nonviolent offenses. Judges take liberties with sentencing loopholes, or worse yet, engage in nepotism with private prisons and other capitalist entities in the criminal justice system. Some decarceration organizations put together court watch groups of legal advocates and even ordinary people to help hold judges accountable. In my city, some local black activists organized a Black Mama Bailout Fund to help get black mothers out of jail to see their kids on Mother's Day. People like @Dameron68 on Twitter are working inside the DeKalb County Jail in Georgia to help improve unsafe and unsanitary conditions. Education and propaganda are also a very powerful tool. Police especially will do anything they can do to cover for each other's misconduct and bad behavior. Using Freedom of Information Act requests to demand transparency from police departments can reveal a lot of violence and prejudice. Cops frequently hold copaganda events in poor black, brown, and immigrant communities to help build false trust with the people they're over-policing. Shining a light on the truth can help keep those communities strong against police violence and infiltration. It can also be useful to have Know Your Rights trainings for people who are targeted by the police. Knowing your rights won't always save you from arrest or discrimination, but it sometimes can, and it can help you after the fact in court. Police exist to defend private property and capital for the capitalist class and reinforce divisions in the working class. This is why they're called class traitors. They violently defend the people who oppress the working class, themselves included. They break strikes, they evict squatters and loiterers, and even legal tenants. I live in Arkansas, which has some of the worst tenants' rights laws in the country. We don't even have legal habitability standards. That means that landlords have no obligation to keep their properties hygienic or safe to live in. Changing the laws here can be good praxis, but that takes years and lawyers to accomplish. It might be better to put together neighborhood maintenance committees that can do repairs, especially for families who couldn't otherwise afford it. Organizing labor unions and fighting for things like minimum wage, maximum wage, price controls, market regulations, etc. can help give the working class economic mobility that they need to create greater systemic change. We must create dual power structures to meet people's material needs for food and housing so that capital can't use it to put pressure on us. But doing what we can to counter that pressure is critical. Using labor to create better wages and working conditions also reduces incentive for people to join the military. Labor would be a good area to organize demand for universal healthcare, since healthcare in the US is tied to employers. Capital is also the main driver of pollution and climate change. The most famous example I can think of for defensive praxis against this is the water protectors at Standing Rock and at every other pipeline that Indigenous people have protested. Canada and the United States love to run dangerous pipelines through Indigenous land in clear violation of any treaties that were ever made to protect Indigenous sovereignty, and every time, thousands of gallons of oil spills out of those pipelines and into water supply. While their protest was legal, they were met with violent state suppression, including being sprayed with fire hoses in freezing weather and being pepper sprayed. Activists fight these measures in courts as much as possible, and things like the Green New Deal being introduced in Congress would help to prevent some of the damage to the environment caused by our capitalist mode of production. Adjacent to the state but firmly in the realm of capital are private prisons. Even in public prisons, prisoners are used as a cheap or even free labor supply for huge corporations like Starbucks, Walmart, Whole Foods, etc. There are defensive tactics that work internally in these places, like making sure inmates have adequate legal representation, whistleblowing about bad conditions, and working with external organizations to end solitary confinement and the death penalty via policy change and public awareness. Capital itself is especially hard to defend against, however, since laws affect it less directly than they affect the state. Capital and the state have spent a long time engineering antagonism within the working class via racism, misogyny, queerphobia, ableism, etc. As such, for every revolutionary movement, there will be a counter-revolutionary movement of reactionaries trying to pop up cultural hierarchy and hegemony. Right now, as hyperbolic as some people on the right seem to think this is, we're seeing a resurgence of fascism. My favorite quote about anti-fascism comes from an interview in Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook by Mark Bray. You fight them by writing letters and making phone calls so you don't have to fight them with fists. You fight them with fists so you don't have to fight them with knives. You fight them with knives so you don't have to fight them with guns. You fight them with guns so you don't have to fight them with tanks. I think this neatly encapsulates both defensive and deconstructive approaches to reactionary elements. 90% of Antifa work is done with records. Can you clearly identify a person as a fascist via their activities, their associates, and their rhetoric? Despite the mainstream narrative, anti-fascists are quite careful about who they oppose. For one, resources are limited, and anti-fascists are usually people with families and jobs to focus on. They can't just go running after every reactionary asshole. And two, it's surprisingly hard to generate consequences for fascist organizing within the confines of legality. Antifa use research to put names to faces to fascist organizers, but if everyone in that person's life supports what they do, it does no good. The physical confrontations you see on the news happen after weeks, months, or even years of trying to defund fascists, have their permits pulled, and expose them to social pressure. Voting records, social media profiles, job websites, and court records are all publicly available resources for finding information on fascist organizers. Craftier anti-fascists have used background check websites, GPS trackers, keyloggers, and other tools to gather information. If nothing else, gathering this information makes it possible to alert marginalized people to fascist presence that may put them in danger. I'll forego talking about anti-fascist protest for now. There's a guide available for patrons on my Patreon page that talks about protest safety, written by myself and my partner with insight from more experienced activists, and I may turn that into a video in the future. What I will say is that anti-fascism doesn't end at street protests any more than it begins with them. When fascists gain any kind of power, they use that power for fascist organizing as well, and that gives weight to what may have been harmless, quote-unquote, rhetoric or protesting in the past. Cutting off fascist organizing before it gains the legitimacy of state violence or the power of capital manipulation is a key part of defensive praxis. People like Steve Bannon entering the White House and situations like the terror plot among law enforcement in Germany are what happens when we fail to stop fascists in the early stages, and fighting fascism in this defensive way will never end fascism. That only comes from deconstructing the institutions of capital and the state that enable them and incentivize their behavior. Here's the part of the video you've been waiting for. In left book groups and on Twitter, I see people expressing a common desire. They want to storm the ICE camps. This is one of those ideas that serves a few purposes when expressed online. Some people are serious. They would do it if they had the resources or the knowledge or the experience. If someone set it up and could guarantee that they would face no consequences as a result, they would do it. If it put them on the news and made fascists say their name in infamy, they would do it. And in some way, they feel guilt knowing that they live in a country and are coerced to participate in a system that would create the camps. So letting people know that they would do it helps absolve them of that guilt. But that doesn't help the people imprisoned there. Every bit of your love and rage that fills your desire to storm the camps should also fill your desire to feed hungry people. I'm not saying that storming and liberating the camps is a bad idea at all. I'm saying that if you do it, and you've ever posted about it on social media, you will go to prison if you're not killed. I ran a poll on Twitter asking if people knew what I meant by the phrase security culture, and the results were not great. I'm going to include a link to the 5th documentary in Sub.Media's Trouble series, but I really recommend watching all of them if you're interested in revolutionary praxis. Number 5 is called You Are Being Watched. I'm begging you to watch this if you want to engage in political action beyond liberal defensive measures, whether constructive or deconstructive. It describes things like COINTELPRO, FBI infiltration and informants during 2000s movements, and surveillance via social media especially. It sounds paranoid, but the US has a long and storied history of suppressing leftist revolutionary movements. Even if your organizing hasn't attracted state attention, it will when it becomes effective in any way that really matters. They watched the J20 protests, they watched Occupy, they're watching Antifa now. I've personally met and spoken to activists who are approached by the FBI for their organizing. There are organizations like the anarchist Black Cross that help to free people who are in prison for political action, but it's better not to get there in the first place. There are some basic ways to protect yourself. Surveillance is a fact of life, and you can't let your fear stop you from organizing. We have to do this work, so we have to be careful. For one, your social media is the easiest way to track your actions. It's information that you intentionally put on the internet, usually publicly for anyone to see. Maybe don't do that. And it's not just crowing about the praxis you're engaging in or edge posting about what you wish you could do. It's little interpersonal conflict you have with the people in your circles. It's family relationships and romantic relationships and fallings out and squabbles. Keep those things off social media as much as possible, especially if you're doing this work. Those things can be used to sow discord within a movement and disrupt organizing. Don't put your job on social media unless you have to, and if you do, it might be wise to have a public account and a SOC account for different kinds of social circles. On the most basic level, just consider what you're projecting into the public. Do not plan praxis on social media. That means via Facebook groups or Messenger, Twitter DMs, Discord, or anything else. These platforms are accessible to infiltration and law enforcement even if they're private. Use encrypted platforms like Signal, Telegram, and Proton Mail. There's some debate about the safety of Telegram because its code is untested, but there's some debate about the safety of Signal because of the information the NSA has been able to pull from the digital envelope of messages, even if they can't see the content. I haven't heard any difficulties with Proton Mail, and Proton even offers a free VPN service called Proton VPN. Don't ever bring your daily use cell phone with you if you don't want someone to know where you are. Burner phones are fairly inexpensive and still useful even in 2019. Pay for things with cash or prepaid gift cards if you're going to use them for praxis, and don't buy them on the day of your action. Also, don't withdraw large amounts of cash all at once. I know how paranoid all this sounds, but in the description I'm going to link to the Frontline documentary about the things Edward Snowden revealed from the NSA. If there's information the government needs to protect itself from revolutionary action, it's going to acquire it, the law be damned. And the government aside, if you've ever seen the Discord chat dumps from groups like Unicorn Riot on Twitter, you'll know exactly how important it is to organize on a secure platform. Just don't tell fascists that. Things like secure platforms can help protect your web traffic while it's in the air, but that's only as effective as the trust you have with the person you're talking to. If you've said something in confidence, but then someone posts screenshots on social media or sends information to the FBI, you're just as screwed as if you had posted it yourself. Organize locally. Build relationships with the people you do praxis with outside of your organizing. If you meet someone new and they demand access to your organizing spaces, try to push their way in, try to create interpersonal conflict, or if they have some mysterious source of funding, or if they try to get you to admit to violence, you need to be able to close ranks. Mexi is pretty famous now for saying, move at the speed of trust, and that's absolutely a fantastic rule. If you don't trust someone, if something smells wrong to you, trust your gut and trust your comrades who you know have your back. Also, beware of bad jacketing, though. Having a bad feeling about someone without concrete evidence is a good enough reason for you to be cautious, but it's not a good enough reason to leave someone out in the cold, vulnerable to fash and feds. We have to learn how to trust each other while being cautious and smart about the dangers. Trust, consent, respect, and humility have to guide us. And I can't believe that I have to say this to people who call themselves leftists in the year of our Lord 2019, but don't talk to cops. I don't care why you're doing it, don't do it. If they approach you, don't do it. If you get arrested, don't do it. Don't do it even if you think you can get information from them, because you will not beat cops and feds at 4D fucking chess. Even against your best efforts, there's a chance that you will let something slip. Cops lie about what they know, and they expect you to connect the dots for them. You can't do that if you don't talk to them. Cops are no replacement for a network of people that you trust, and talking to cops can put that entire network in jeopardy. As always, the most secure form of communication for revolutionary organizing is just a quiet conversation in private. Leave your phones at home, meet somewhere safe, and get up to trouble. What kind of trouble? I'm glad you asked. Let's talk tactics. I'm not going to go too hard here because I'd like to keep my channel, and I may have already said too much. Someone sent me a really interesting article on Curious Cat about Slavoj Žižek's catchphrase, "I would prefer not to." I'll link it in the description with the other million things that I'm sourcing that you'll have to sift through. po you at this point. It's about praxis via occupying the position of externality via targeted noncompliance. This is in the same realm as worker slowdowns, strikes, and slacktivism in my mind. Non-Compete and Radical Reviewer had a great video about slacktivist tactics in the workplace, and there's a subreddit dedicated to the concept of malicious compliance, which can be used for all manner of praxis. These tactics can be used to bring the flow of capital to a halt, which is an effective method of deconstruction if done in a sustained way over a long enough period. Rads and Non-Compete also have a great collaborative video about more proactive tactics for a fictional anarchist they were writing about. The Trouble series on sub.media has a lot of information on tactics to fight gentrification, incarceration, patriarchy, etc. That series is intended to be watched in groups, so make sure to have comrades and popcorn handy and use the discussion questions afterwards. Study historical examples of deconstructive and insurrectionary political actions. Although they didn't bring the revolution, studying labor strikes, the Black Panthers, the Zapatistas, and other revolutionary groups and actions can be instructive in our current climate. Right now I'm personally reading The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, and there's even something to be learned from slave revolts and peasant uprisings that happened hundreds of years ago. Our conditions today are different in so many ways, but class struggle is very old, and history can still be illuminating and inspiring. Generally, when people think of revolution, they see something destructive and violent, and a revolution does have to be deconstructive and violent in some ways, but that's why all of this praxis must coexist simultaneously. We can't deconstruct the state and capital without building dual power structures to meet people's needs. We can't successfully build the new society in the shell of the old if we're not defending ourselves in our efforts against suppression. Sometimes that takes radical measures. I mentioned propaganda of the deed earlier. The original context of that phrase is a revolutionary action, a radical action, sometimes a violent action that spurs other people to revolutionary action. Things like sabotage, riots, and other forms of direct action should be applied judiciously to advance the goals of a revolution. Step back off the riot shaming. It's a valid tactic. Especially for the people whose lives are threatened not just by climate change and fascism, but by the normal functioning of neoliberalism and capitalism and white supremacy. This is what I mean by the state having a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. We see the violence of a riot, but we don't see the violence of over-policing and deportation and incarceration. To reference PhilosophyTube's video on Antifa, which has a lot of great points about political violence, headlines say things like, violence breaks out after police kill a student. After police kill a student, not when. Any violence done by the working class against the state in the name of liberation will always be self-defense. There's a term I don't like for a lot of reasons called adventurism, but it does sometimes refer to something very real. The best way for capitalism to defang revolutionary action is to turn it into a lifestyle and an aesthetic. I'll bring up my example of liberating the ice camps again. If your first concern in any insurrectionary action isn't to advance a struggle against an insurmountable wall, or to relieve people from oppression, then your action is dangerous not just for you, but the people who will face crackdowns and further oppressions when you fail. It should never be done in the absence of any constructive praxis efforts, and it shouldn't be the first tactic for defensive or deconstructive efforts. I dislike calling all radical action adventurism, however. I think it puts limits on people's imagination. Do I think that organizations like the Socialist Rifle Association or Redneck Revolt, rest in peace, are going to successfully conduct an armed revolution against the US government when our military clearly has superior weapons tech and firepower? No, definitely not. Do I think it's responsible and good for marginalized people to arm themselves and create networks for community self-defense against police and fascist elements? Yes. Unironically, you can't change my mind. And while I'm hesitant to name specific examples, we should be wary of the way that words like terrorist are used to dismiss what could be legitimate instances of class struggle, especially in countries where the US and its allies are engaged in military occupation. Most of what I've talked about here has been focused in the United States, but for a revolution to be effective, it has to be international. If a revolution is isolated, even if it's successful over its local oppressive forces, that gap can be immediately filled by another imperial power. This means building communication and solidarity with groups engaged in revolutionary struggle in other countries. Not only can we learn what works and what doesn't work from our comrades across the world, we can work together to weaken global capitalism on a massive scale using localized, coordinated action. If an arms factory in one country gets disabled by strikes or other methods, then maybe a nation-state doesn't have enough ammunition to crush a revolutionary struggle in another country. This goes especially for those of us living in imperialist countries like the United States. How can our praxis be used to help our international comrades who share in our struggle against our nation state? I made a video a while back called How to Make Communist Art, and that video was not a visual arts tutorial. That video is about this. For a revolution to happen, it has to happen not only in our external world and our material conditions, but inside of us. We have to be able to conceive of the revolution. I have to be able to take communism from the pages of Das Kapital and the Conquest of Bread onto the streets of Little Rock and into my home and into my relationships. That takes an incredible amount of creativity. Praxis is how we take our principles and our beliefs as communists, as anarchists, as anti-capitalists, and make them into reality. You and your local comrades and your community are the only ones who know how those principles can be applied in your lives, so be creative. Be collaborative. The grand messianic revolution is not inevitable. We have to make it happen for ourselves, and we have precious little time. So I want you to ask yourself, do you really want it? What is it worth to you? Can you taste it? So this one was a doozy to write. You can contact me at any of the places you're seeing on the screen right now. I want to give a special thanks to my friends John and Shell because they were really supportive and helpful, and I want to thank Red Andre for reading over my script and everybody else who read over my script. Really, really helped me with this one. And then I want to thank all of the following patrons who have pledged me $5 or more and help keep me afloat to write very long-term papers about Praxis. Special thanks to Alel Dev, Brooklyn Mason, Cooley Callahan, Courtney Hairbrained Girl Westmoreland, Farty Barfslab, Femi Oladipupo, I'm so sorry, Gavin Howard, Indoor Wah, Joseph Gunson, May Cohen, Millennia Scrunching Piper, Peter Coffin, Princess Choo Choo, Puffin Bird, Red Andre, River Ransom, Rob Hutton, Solal, Thomas Shelby, 3 Hedgehogs in a Trench Coat, Tranarchist Babe, Will Henry, Wooly, and Zachary Seeley Payne. Love you all. Bye-bye.